I never imagined that my life, one defined by tradition and devotion, would be turned upside down in a single moment. My name is Admir Abihatzira. I am a 69-year-old Jewish man, born and raised as a rabbi in the rich spiritual soil of Israel. My father was also a rabbi, and my childhood revolved around the Torah and Talmud, which became my compass. When I was just 11, my family relocated to America. We settled in the land of opportunity, but my calling remained the same: to teach God's law and guide others. As a rabbi, I spent my life doing just that, both in synagogues and in the homes of my community. In my later years, I grew partly deaf. I relied on hearing aids to navigate the world, but my deafness brought unexpected blessings. It deepened my relationship with God's Word. In the quiet, I found solace, reflection, and a stronger sense of purpose. I currently reside in Ventura County, California. My days are filled with prayer, study, and service to my congregation. Or at least they were until June 12, 2022. That day changed everything. It was a hot afternoon, the kind where the California sun feels relentless. Around 3:20 p.m., I found myself standing at the intersection of Thousand Oaks Boulevard and Westlake Boulevard. Pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian rallies had converged in the same area, sparked by the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. The atmosphere was electric, charged with emotion and anger. I was there to support Israel, my homeland, the land of my ancestors. I waved an Israeli flag proudly, standing among others who shared my convictions. Across the street, pro-Palestinian demonstrators held their own banners high. At first, it was just noise, chants, slogans, voices clashing in a cacophony of conviction. But then the tension boiled over. A confrontation erupted. Supporters from both sides moved toward each other, their voices escalating into shouts, their faces red with anger. And there I was, caught in the middle of it all, still holding my flag. I didn't see who did it. One moment, I was standing firm, and the next, I felt a forceful shove from behind. My body went weightless, and then I hit the ground with a sickening thud. My head struck the pavement, and an explosion of pain followed. I felt warmth trickling down my scalp, blood. A lot of it. People screamed, their voices muffled, as if I were underwater. My vision blurred. I remember someone shouting to call an ambulance. Everything around me became distant, as though I were sinking into an abyss. I was quickly rushed to a hospital. As the emergency team in the hospital worked to stabilize me, I whispered a prayer. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. It was the last thing I could manage before the world went completely silent. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the hospital. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. I stood in a vast, endless space, silent, empty, yet heavy with a sense of presence. My heart pounded, but there was no sound, no echo. I wasn't alone. The silence was deafening. I couldn't see anything. It was as though I had been plunged into an endless void, gray, shapeless, cold. But the silence was alive. I could feel something, or someone, moving around me. Shadows circled, close enough that I could sense them, yet distant enough that I couldn't make out what they were. Their presence sent a chill down my spine. Then it happened. The gray began to shift, turning into a deep, pulsating red. My instincts screamed at me, danger. The air grew thick and oppressive, as if it were fighting me for every breath. Heat swelled around me, burning my skin without touching it. The shadows grew clearer now, but not in a way that brought relief. They had no faces, only outlines that seemed to shimmer like smoke. And yet, they whispered. Their voices were everywhere, surrounding me, speaking words I couldn't understand. It wasn't just the sound of their whispers that terrified me. It was the weight of them, like they carried secrets I wasn't ready to hear. I looked down at myself and froze. My clothes were in tatters, torn as though I had been through a great battle. My hands trembled. Something about my very being felt exposed, vulnerable. I had no idea where I was or what awaited me, but fear gripped me like an iron vice. And yet, I couldn't stay still. An invisible force urged me forward. I tried to resist, to plant my feet and remain where I was, but my body betrayed me. Step by step, I moved through the void. In the distance, massive doors began to take shape. They towered over me, each one carved with intricate details and glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. As I drew closer, I saw the inscriptions. Each door bore a name: Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, others. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, vibrating in a way that made my chest tighten. The sight alone was overwhelming, but what shook me to my core was the final door. Children of Israel. I stopped, or at least I tried to. My feet wouldn't listen. Something was dragging me toward that door, pulling me closer with every passing moment. Panic set in. I fought against the invisible force with everything I had, but it was no use. My heart pounded in my chest as I drew nearer and nearer to the massive structure. The door loomed over me, impossibly large, its surface smooth and cold despite the oppressive heat around me. Before I could process what was happening, the door creaked open. Darkness spilled out, thick and suffocating, swallowing the faint red glow that surrounded me. And then came the sounds, screams. They weren't just ordinary cries of pain. They were raw, guttural, and endless. Human voices, yet so filled with agony that they barely sounded human. Each scream carried a weight that tore through me, shaking me to my core. The heat intensified, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. My skin felt as though it would blister, but the true pain wasn't physical. It was deeper than that, a searing ache that gripped my very soul. Every step I took into the darkness felt like a betrayal of myself, but I couldn't stop. The further I went, the more the pain grew. It wasn't just in my body, it was in my spirit. It was as though every regret, every failure, every hidden sin was being dragged into the light and laid bare for me to see. And yet, I kept moving. I froze as the truth hit me like a thunderclap. This place, this endless void of agony, it was hell. Through the door, a vast and bottomless valley stretched out before me. It was a sight that no earthly words could ever prepare me for. The ground wasn't solid. It was alive, shifting and writhing like a wounded creature. Heat waves rolled across the valley in choking bursts, carrying with them the piercing screams of countless souls. The sound pierced me to my core, each cry a dagger, each wail a haunting reminder of unimaginable suffering. And then I saw them, my people. They were scattered across the valley, their faces twisted in expressions of unbearable pain and sorrow. These weren't strangers. These were my kin, people I had known, people I had shared meals with, prayed alongside. But here, their cries weren't prayers. They were raw, guttural screams of regret and hopelessness. Some of them looked straight at me, their eyes pleading, their mouths moving as if to speak. I wanted to reach out to help them, to do something, but when I lifted my hands, I froze. My hands were on fire. The flames licked at my skin, but it wasn't the kind of fire we know on Earth. It burned deeper, scorching not just flesh but soul. I watched helplessly as my hands glowed with the same unholy light that surrounded the valley. It was as if I had become part of the torment, a living, breathing fragment of the suffering that consumed this place. In the distance, enormous pillars of fire rose from the depths. They were monstrous and unyielding, reaching heights that defied logic. These weren't just flames. They were symbols. Symbols of power. Symbols of wealth. The things people had clung to in life. The idols they had worshipped instead of God. And beneath those pillars stood souls. Millions of them. Their forms were charred and broken, yet they could not die. Among them were faces I recognized. Faces that had once been powerful, admired, even envied. Politicians, business tycoons, celebrities. They were all here, stripped of their power, stripped of their pride, Now, they stood in chains of flame, their wealth and influence nothing more than ash in the wind. One of them approached me. He was gaunt, his eyes hollow, surrounded by a wreath of fire that danced around him like a crown of mockery. His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper, but every word cut through the oppressive heat like a blade. "We were chosen," he rasped. "We were given grace, but we squandered it. We helped no one. We glorified ourselves. And now we pay the price." His words were a mirror, reflecting the truth I had been too deaf to hear. Among the souls were religious leaders, rabbis, priests, teachers, men who had stood in places of authority, trusted to guide others toward the truth. But they had failed. They had led people astray, basking in their own influence instead of pointing them toward God. And I was among them. The weight of shame bore down on me, heavier than the flames. It was crushing, suffocating. In that moment, the realization struck with unrelenting force. No matter how devout I thought I had been, no matter how closely I had followed the Torah, I had rejected Jesus, the Messiah, the very one I had spent my life denying. That truth burned hotter than any fire in this valley. I was pushed forward, deeper into the abyss. With every step, the cries grew louder. The souls around me screamed in agony, their voices echoing off the unseen walls of this forsaken place. "We rejected him," they wailed. "We turned away from the Savior, and now we suffer." The regret in their voices was unbearable. They didn't just cry out in pain, they cried out in longing for a second chance, for the opportunity to undo what they had done. Their words were drenched in remorse, their sorrow filling the air like a suffocating fog. I wanted to cover my ears, to block out their cries, but it was useless. Their regret was my regret. Their suffering was my suffering. Every word they spoke was a reflection of the truth I had refused to see in life. Why didn't I listen? One soul screamed. Why didn't I see the truth when it was right in front of me? Another voice joined in, then another, and another, until the valley was filled with a deafening chorus of regret. Their words overlapped, a symphony of despair that drilled into my very soul. I could feel my spirit breaking under the weight of it all. The heat, the screams, the pain, it was too much. And yet, I was still alive, still aware, still conscious. This wasn't just punishment. It was revelation, a brutal, unrelenting unveiling of the truth I had refused to accept. I reached the end of the valley, my feet teetering on the edge of a massive cliff. Below me stretched an abyss, so dark it seemed to swallow every trace of light. It wasn't just darkness, it was void, emptiness that felt alive, pulling at my soul. I looked down and my breath caught. The abyss wasn't empty. Souls swirled in its depths, their agony etched into their hollow eyes. These were not strangers. They were the souls of those who had violated God's laws, people who had misled others with their lives. And now, their suffering screamed louder than words ever could. Their eyes met mine, piercing through me. I felt their pain, their regret, and worst of all, their unspoken accusation. It was as if their torment mirrored the failures I had yet to face within myself. I stood frozen, unable to look away. But deep within me, something began to stir. There had to be a purpose to all of this, I told myself. Could this really be the end for me? Was I destined to share their fate, condemned to this torment forever? Or was there still hope? I wanted answers, but the air grew heavier. Each step I took deeper into this realm made breathing feel impossible. The suffering around me wasn't just physical. It was like the very core of their souls was being shredded, wrapped in shame and regret. That shame clung to me as well, heavier with each passing second. Then, out of the suffocating darkness, a figure emerged. His silhouette was frail, but his presence was heavy. He wore a torn and scorched rabbi's robe, the fabric hanging in tatters. His face, oh, God! His face was a nightmare. It was melted, twisted. his features erased until only dark, empty voids remained where his eyes should have been. The figure came closer, his voice like a rasping wind. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. "This is who I was," he said, gesturing to the tattered remains of his robe. A spiritual leader, once tasked with guiding others to God. But now, his voice cracked and his head lowered. "Now I am nothing. I failed my calling." He paused, and his hollow gaze seemed to burn through me. "We are the ones who saw ourselves as superior," he said, his voice filled with a sorrow that cut deeper than any scream. "We neglected our duty to lead. We denied Jesus. And now we stand here, stripped of everything." His words struck like a thunderbolt. My mind raced back through my life. For years, I had rejected Jesus, mocked him, shunned any mention of his name. I clung to my traditions, my laws, my rituals, convincing myself they were enough. But what if they weren't? What if I had spent my life chasing shadows while ignoring the light? The figure's voice grew softer, almost mournful. "This is the cost of pride, of rejecting truth when it was within reach." I felt my knees give way. My legs collapsed beneath me, and I fell to the ground. Tears poured from my eyes, hot and relentless. My heart felt like it was breaking apart, weighed down by regret, so overwhelming it was almost unbearable. Through my sobs, I whispered the ancient prayer I had known all my life once again. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. But this time, the words felt empty. For the first time in my life, I realized the prayer meant nothing if my heart wasn't aligned with God's truth. My voice cracked as I finished, and I sat there in the silence, hollow and broken. The figures that surrounded me, the lost souls in their torment, began to fade. One by one, they vanished, dissolving into the very shadows from which they had emerged. Their anguished cries still lingered in the air, echoing, but I could no longer see them. Only the emptiness remained, a vast, consuming void that seemed to swallow everything, even the last remnants of my hope. In that hollow silence, I felt an emptiness inside me that went deeper than anything I had ever known. I had spent my life believing that I was deserving of God's love. I had followed the law, believed in my righteousness. But now, in this place, it all seemed like a cruel deception. I was nothing. I had nothing. The pride I had clung to for so long, the convictions that I was somehow above others crumbled. In an instant, I was stripped bare, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. I was left with nothing but overwhelming regret. It was a weight I could never lift on my own. And then, suddenly, through the oppressive darkness, a light began to emerge. I couldn't explain it. It didn't feel like a normal light. But even so, something deep inside me stirred. I didn't know if it was a final call from God, or maybe just a fragment of His mercy reaching into the depths of this abyss. But I knew it was something important. The light radiated warmth, a kind of comfort I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just warmth in the physical sense. It was like the warmth of a promise of redemption, of hope. And within that light, I saw Him. There was no need to ask His name. I knew who He was instinctively, as if I had always known. Jesus. He stood there, bathed in this radiant light, His presence somehow both gentle and firm. There was a depth to Him, a gravity I could feel in my very bones. His robes were pure white, untouched by the darkness around us. But it wasn't just His appearance that struck me. It was the weight of His presence. His gaze, it wasn't harsh or condemning. It was full of judgment, yes, but also full of compassion. It was as if He could see straight into the depths of my soul, into every corner I had hidden from others and even from myself. He approached me, and I felt my heart race. I could barely breathe under the weight of it all. And then His voice. "I see the goodness in your heart, Admer." I trembled. How could He know me so completely? How could He see anything good in me? After all I had done, after all I had rejected. He continued, "Your actions have brought salvation to many families. You have done good in the world." I thought of all the people I had helped, all the families who had benefited from my kindness. It wasn't enough, though. I could feel that. Jesus went on, his tone soft but firm. "But despite the good deeds, you are here because you rejected me. You refused to accept me. You denied the truth, the very foundation of salvation." My heart sank. This was it. This was the truth I had denied all my life. But he didn't stop there. His voice was filled with such tenderness as he spoke the words I never expected to hear. "Grace is in my hands, and I forgive you." His words washed over me, but I didn't know how to respond. How could I possibly accept this forgiveness when I had turned my back on him for so long? He continued, his voice still filled with that strange mixture of authority and love. "When you return, you must accept me as your Lord and Savior, the true Messiah. Only then will you know peace." A flood of memories rushed through me. I thought of the Muslim family I had helped years ago, the ones who had been in desperate need. I had given them food, comfort, and support in their time of crisis. And because of that, they had sought to know Jesus. They had wanted to learn more about him. I had helped them, but in my heart, I had never accepted the truth of who he was. Jesus looked at me again, his gaze searching, almost tender. "The light within you has not yet faded, but you have been deaf to it. You've ignored it, rejected it, turned your back on it, but it is still there. It always has been." In that moment, the realization hit me like a thunderclap. Jesus had not come just for the Jews. He hadn't come for one people, one group. He had come for all of humanity. Before I could fully grasp the enormity of what he was saying, my vision blurred. My body felt heavy, like I was being pulled, torn between two worlds. The light dimmed, and I felt a sudden emptiness, like I was falling. Then, with a sharp, unexpected gasp, I opened my eyes. The sterile, cold air of the hospital rushed into my lungs. I was back. I was alive. My body was heavy, ached in places I couldn't fully understand. But my heart felt different. I could still feel the weight of what I had just experienced, the words Jesus had spoken, the forgiveness, the hope. I was back, but I was no longer the same. I tried. I really did. The overwhelming truth of what I had seen, what I had felt, was too much for me to hold. The memories of that moment in the dark, the light, the voice, the presence, it all felt unreal. Too unreal. I wanted to bury it, to push it away. The familiar chants, the daily rituals I'd always leaned on, they became my shield. I told myself it was a hallucination. The darkness, the figures, the voice, maybe it was just my mind cracking under the weight of my fear of death. That's what I told myself. I doubted everything, but the call, the weight of it, how could I ignore it? How could I let it slip away like that? The traditions were pulling me back. It felt safe, comfortable, familiar. But deep inside, I knew something had shifted. One morning, everything changed. I was just going through the motions, doing what I always did, trying to drown out that unbearable voice inside me, the voice that had haunted my soul. My body moved on autopilot, but then it happened. It was like a veil, invisible but suffocating, was lifted, not just from my ears, but from my entire soul. For years, I had been deaf, not just physically but spiritually. My ears, once closed off from the world, had been opened. But it wasn't just my hearing that had changed. There, in the middle of my quiet, normal life, a voice pierced through the silence. No more shadows, no more numbness. Just this voice, loud, clear, and urgent, as though it had been waiting for me. I sat up in my room, staring into the empty air, my heart pounding. The strangest part, I wasn't wearing my hearing aids. I could hear without them. I hadn't heard anything in years. Not since the accident, not since the world had gone dark for me. But now it was as if the world itself was speaking to me, calling me to something. And then, I saw him. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shadow in the doorway, standing perfectly still. But the weight of his presence was overwhelming, like a fire without burning. His eyes, those eyes, they pierced straight through me, not with judgment, but with an understanding I couldn't comprehend. It was Jesus. I knew it. There was no question. He spoke to me, softly but with authority, telling me things I hadn't wanted to hear. He told me he had seen my heart, that despite everything, my life, my efforts, my rejection, he had seen something good in me. My works, my actions, they had brought light to others. But in all of it, I had ignored him. I had shut him out. He told me that my time wasn't over yet, but it was not too late, that he had extended a path to salvation to me. I had turned my back on it, but his grace, it had never left me. He said that my hearing, this miraculous healing, wasn't just a physical gift. It was a symbol of something greater, a spiritual awakening. When he said it, I felt it deep within me. I couldn't deny it. I couldn't. I was wrong. All this time, I had been wrong. Jesus wasn't just for some of us. He was for all of us. And then he told me something that left me gasping for air. When I return, you must proclaim the truth. You cannot turn away from me. I felt the weight of those words, the responsibility, the urgency, and the peace that came with them. It was clear. There was no more running, no more hiding. I was called, but even now, I still wasn't ready to fully accept it. The pull of my old ways was strong. The familiar habits, the prayers, the rituals, they all felt like a blanket over me, trying to keep me warm from the unknown. Yet, I could not ignore the light that had pierced through the darkness, or the truth that was now laid bare before me. No matter how much I tried to resist, I knew in my soul that I could never turn away from Jesus again. As Jesus' figure began to fade, the room around me grew darker. The light that had once flooded my being now seemed to slip away, like sand falling through my fingers. I wanted to cry out, to hold on to him, but the words caught in my throat. The glow, that warmth, the peace that had overwhelmed me, all of it began to retreat, leaving only a lingering, faint echo, and then silence. I was alone in the quiet of my bedroom, the same room where I had once sat in darkness and confusion. But now, the silence didn't feel the same. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. There was something in it, something that remained even after the light had disappeared. The miracle still lingered. I could hear the sound of my own breath, the rustle of my clothes, the distant hum of life outside my window. I had never heard any of this so clearly before. My hearing, my real hearing, had been restored. It was more than just a physical change. It was a sign, a proof, a reminder that everything I had experienced was not just a dream, not some trick of the mind, but the undeniable truth. Jesus had touched me, and I couldn't pretend it didn't happen. I couldn't turn my back on it anymore. In the days that followed, everything in my life felt different. The beliefs I had held on to for so long began to unravel. I had been taught that salvation was something we earned, something we worked for. I had clung to pride, to stubbornness, to tradition, believing it all kept me safe. But now, I saw the truth for what it was. Jesus wasn't a distant figure. He was real, present, and so much more than I had ever understood. And so, I let go. I let go of the pride that had kept me bound to my old ways. I let go of the stubbornness that had kept me from seeing the light. And in that letting go, I embraced Jesus. I didn't just acknowledge him, I accepted him. The peace that flooded my soul in that moment was like nothing I had ever known. It wasn't fleeting. It wasn't temporary. It was lasting. I wanted to share this peace. I needed to share it. So, I went to my family. I told them what had happened. I told them how my life had changed. I told them about Jesus, about the truth I had seen. At first, they didn't believe me. Some of them were shocked. Others laughed. Some were doubtful. even dismissive. They didn't understand. How could anyone understand something so profound, so life-altering? But time changes things. Slowly, my words began to sink in. The seed had been planted. Their hearts, though resistant at first, began to soften. They could see the change in me, the peace, the joy that had replaced the confusion and fear. And one by one, they began to listen. It wasn't instant. It wasn't easy. But over time, they saw the truth. They saw the change in me, and they knew something had happened, something that couldn't be denied. And then one day, I realized something. The truth that Jesus had shown me wasn't just for me. It wasn't just something I could keep to myself. The message he had given me, the transformation he had brought into my life, that was meant to be shared. I didn't know how my family would respond. I didn't know how the world would respond. But I knew this: Jesus had changed me. He had healed me. And no matter the cost, I couldn't keep that to myself, because the truth was undeniable. And it was the truth that would set them and me free. So I stood tall. I spoke the words he had given me. I shared my testimony with anyone who would listen, trusting that God would do the rest. I may have been unsure of many things in this new life, but one thing I knew without a doubt: I had been saved, and I have a responsibility to proclaim it to the world. This was the beginning of my new journey, a journey of faith, hope, and unshakable truth.